All right, I'm going to go ahead and start this webinar. We have a pretty robust deck today, so go ahead and start on time. We'll have a few people joining us late, but as always, we will be recording this, or we are recording this, and we'll post this on our website later if you miss any of it or can't stay the entire time. Welcome to the Dominion Payroll webinar. We've been silent for a couple of weeks as we've been waiting for some things to come out of Washington, and then they all came out during the same 4 or 5 day period. So the original title of this is the primary focus of this webinar will be the OSHA temporary standard. However, we're also going to cover a couple things that came out in the infrastructure bill that is on Biden's desk right now. So we'll start there, then we'll get into the meat of the ETS, and then we'll finish up with some instructions around how to use iSolved if you're one of our clients to help you document and track the requirements of the ETS if it eventually becomes law. And we'll go into that in just a second. But with me today, I'm very pleased to have my friends Tracy Clark and Kevin Wilson and Olivia from our marketing team. Hi guys, how's it going?
Good.
It's been a while.
It has been a while. Appreciate you guys joining me today. It's it's kind of feast or famine with this information, and we're like I said, it's been a busy week in Washington, and our last week was a busy week. They're on recess this week, and they'll be back next week. So meanwhile, there are some things happening in the courts, and we'll talk about that. And then we have a pretty important update around the employee retention tax credit. So buckle up, grab some coffee. As always, please submit us any questions that you have, either on these topics or something else related. And please use the Q&A function and not the chat. That way we can record your messages after the fact in case we need to reference those. Like I said earlier, we are recording this webinar, and we will post it on our website by the end of the day today, which will be on our COVID-19 resource page. That page also has a lot of other things that you might find useful. And of course, if something's not there and you're looking for it, please let us know at questions@dominionpayroll.com, and we'll find it and post it for you as soon as we can. Okay, quick shameless plug for our year-end seminar, which is next Thursday, the 18th at 8:30 in the morning. You can choose to attend in person, or you can dial in. We hope you come in person if you feel safe to do that. We've got a pretty large, airy room in our community room there at our Dominion Payroll headquarters in Scott's Addition in Richmond, and we'd love to see you in person. But if you can join online too, that's also fine. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this event, it is our annual sort of half-day rundown of all the things you should be thinking about as we approach the end of the calendar year. So anything from taxes to benefits to item ACA reporting to items in iSolved. It's a great way to sort of make your checklist for the as we round out 2021, which is unbelievable to me that it's already the end of 2021, but time marches forward. Okay. So we're going to start out with some news about the Employee Retention Credit Program, and I'm going to ask Tracy to explain what's going on.
Okay. We got some news of this back in August when the Senate first put the infrastructure bill out there, and it had this little caveat about ERC, which is the Employee Retention Credit Program, in there that they wanted it to end on 9/30/2021. And at that time, it looked like that we kind of turned a corner with COVID. However, as we've gone on, COVID has still raised its ugly head and kind of called the shots on things, but they left it in there. And then it went on to the House. So this was early August, and the House had at least 2 months prior to the end of the second the third quarter in which to pass this and make these credits not available for the fourth quarter. And as most people know, if you've followed the infrastructure bill at all, the House never brought it to a vote. They kept pushing and changing things and trying to angle this and angle that. And when they finally did pass it, which was last week, the ERC program termination was still in there. I had a feeling that it was going to be, just because it was such a footnote to everything else that was going on inside that bill, that I just felt like that nobody was really going to come forward and address that. And that is what happened. So basically, Congress has passed the bill and it's been sent to Biden for signature. So we're waiting on that. And I put in there, although not primarily a tax bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act does contain some provisions that have a tax impact. And one of the big ones for payroll companies is the termination of that employee retention credit program. They made it effective 9/30 of 2021, basically denying access to those credits for all of fourth quarter, unless you're a recovery startup business. And if you think you're one of those, there's not very many of them. There's some caveats to qualifying for that. You had to be a startup in 2020 after February 15th. For now, it's not clear if employers who reduce their payroll tax deposits prior to the passage of the act will face any late deposit penalties for the payrolls that they failed to deposit. They're still in place. Those penalties are still in place. However, most people feel like that the IRS is going to offer some relief on that. And our clients should be watching for IRS. Actually, anyone should be watching for IRS guidance on this issue to see if there's going to be any relief offered and what the plan is to get those taxes paid back. What we are doing is, if you're one of our clients and you are taking advantage of the ERC, is we need to clear your account of those extra credits that may be sitting out there, because oftentimes those credits far exceeded the tax liability for the payrolls that you were processing. And we just need to get your account down to zero. So we're going to stop any further credits being taken at this point, and then we will devise a plan going forward after we get a little more guidance about how to get those taxes paid that you may have negated due to using those credits that are now unavailable. So that's kind of where we are right now on the termination of the retention credit program.
Gosh, I hope they do offer a little bit of relief for those credits that would have happened in the fourth quarter, considering they didn't pass this until early November.
Yeah, I don't think that they're going to give you a pass on the actual tax credits, but I think they may give you a pass on are the penalties
Yeah.
for not paying them on time. However, I mean, it can be for a fairly good sized client, that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars already that they may have used. So it's kind of scary.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to put Tracy's personal cell phone number in the chat here so we can call her directly and vent and complain and ask questions. All right. Thank you, Tracy. I appreciate that. Okay. Speaking of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we're going to kick it over to Kevin now to do one of his famous overviews of this large omnibus bill. Hi, Kevin.
Hi there. It's good to be back, and I'm fresh from reading this 2,702 page bill. Obviously, haven't slept in a week, but now I'm here and just give a quick overview. A lot of this bill, as Tracy alluded to, doesn't necessarily impact payroll or taxes, but it's a huge bill and is going to impact a lot of aspects of American life. So yeah, a little tongue in cheek, it's finally Infrastructure Week. Anybody inside for I think the past 3 presidents, next week was always Infrastructure Week, and this thing has finally passed. So it's a trillion bipartisan bill. 13 Republicans joined the House Democrats to pass this legislation. So the progressive wing of the Democrats really are trying to dig in their heels and hold out for the Build Back Better bill, and 6 of them ultimately voted against this, just hoping to sort of slow the process and get a huge social spending bill through. But again, ultimately it did pass, and the Build Back Better Act is hanging on by a thread, being negotiated out. It doesn't look like a vote would happen on that until probably after Thanksgiving at this point. And that is going to have to go through the reconciliation process in the Senate. And that really hangs on whether the Democrats can get Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema to come on board and pass it by the skin of their teeth with 50 votes and Vice President Harris coming in. So yeah, that is in a nutshell what passed earlier this week. Expecting Biden to sign this next week when Congress comes back. So we can get a little photo op with his book. Let's take a look at what's in this bill. So $1 trillion, a lot of money there. It's sort of interesting though, because really what this bill is comprised of is about $550 billion in new spending, and then the release of about $450 billion in prior approved money, but not necessarily accessible money. This is sort of the ins and outs of these huge spending bills. So it's $550 billion in new dollars entering the economy, pretty much. And it's vast. I mean, it's absolutely massive. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave American infrastructure like roads, bridges, and highways a C- in a report that was pretty damning earlier this year. So yeah, topping, that spend, we're looking at $110 billion going into roads, bridges, all the sidewalks and potholes routinely complain about, and just sort of backyard politics. Money is getting thrown at that. As a big fan of traveling by train, I was excited to see that about 6 is going into Amtrak, which is just investment in passenger rail since Amtrak came into being. So that's both to expand and make more efficient that Northeast corridor, also to expand access to rail throughout the country. Power infrastructure, high-speed internet, that's big here in Virginia. High-speed internet, access to broadband, with lead in throughout the country, Detroit famously, Flint, Michigan, but Baltimore has issues. There's issues all over the country with that. So a lot of money going into that. And then the $50 billion that you see there, the resilience and Western water infrastructure is a long way of there's about dollars to deal with climate change. Access to clean water, preserving infrastructure that helps deal with, whether it's wildfires or storm and flooding infrastructure. So it's not as much Democrats initially wanted to include in the bill. I think it started at 89 billion and was whittled back to 50. And each of these things has sort of a climate provision in that. Trying to modernize all of our infrastructure to deal with a changing climate. And then the last, there's 25 billion for ports. I hear that the newly renovated LaGuardia is free of rats and looking pretty nice these days. So some more money for that all around the country. And then lastly, I mean, of course, every time you hear about these big spending bills coming out of Congress, you got to sort of scratch your head and say, well, how are we paying for this? A lot of talk has gone on over the last couple of months about raising the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. There's been a lot of talk of raising taxes on people making over $400,000 a year. None of that is included in this bill. There's not a tax increase. A lot of this money comes from repurposed COVID funds. Over the last, 2 years now, and for anybody who's been regularly tuning into these webinars knows that we've, gone through the Paycheck Protection Program, the EIDL funds with the SBA, all the unemployment insurance benefits that were federally subsidized, a lot of those buckets still have cash sitting in them, but those programs have wound down. And so Congress sort of grabbed that and said, okay, this is what we're going to fund some of this bill. And then largely, it relies on sort of stimulating economic growth. And so they're pretty generous in saying that this investment will sort of pay for itself with a 33% return on investment, in that, the efficiencies that we realize with better infrastructure around the country will stimulate more people to open businesses and all of that. That has yet to be seen. And then a nonpartisan analysis of this bill does say that it will roughly add $350 billion to the federal deficit over the next 10 years. And so, that's going to have to get paid for somehow, eventually, but that is not the topic of today's webinar. And so that is just where I'm going to wrap it up on the big infrastructure bill. And if the Build Back Better plan does make it to the president's desk in the next couple of weeks, we'll bring you some highlights and let you know how that impacts running your business and your day-to-day life.
Yeah, that is a different topic for a different day, for sure. But thank you, Kevin. That's really helpful, because it's been a little confusing this fall in my mind in terms of the different packages going through, and kind of harkens back to earlier in the pandemic when there's sort of multiple conversations going on and lots of big high dollar bills being batted around. So
absolutely.
Thank
one
you
thing
for
that is worth pointing out is what Tracy was talking about with the ERC credits going away. I mean, that they went away largely because the federal government is trying to spend $1.2 trillion on infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so they are related.
Well, the next time I go over a bridge, I'll think about that, and or Flat of LaGuardia, rat free.
There you go.
Great, thank you. And we do have a quick question here about the year-end seminar, which we talked about a few slides back. And the question is, can non-Dominion payroll clients attend the year-end seminar? And yes, you can. Please do. We're happy to have you.
Yeah, I think just a little caveat on that is you're more than welcome, and there will be good information in there. It is very client focused, and so some of the items that are specific to our iSolve platform may not apply, but there's lots of good info in our year-end seminar about just how to prepare taxes, benefits, all that stuff going into year-end. So the more the merrier. That's right. And I think there's a pretty nice door prize too. I think maybe an iPad is hanging in the balance. So there is, yeah. So we love supporting our client Feedmore, the Central Virginia Food Bank, and so we'll be having a raffle. If you bring canned good, one canned good equals one entry into the raffle. Or if it's easier, you can donate just $1 for each ticket. And each dollar is also an entry. And yeah, get yourself a brand new iPad. Love it. Thank you. And we actually have it in hand. It's not stuck on a container ship in the Pacific. So we're good. We're good on that. Okay. All right. I'm going to take over here and dive into the OSHA Emergency Temporary Standard, which is probably the primary reason you guys are here. We did report out on this back in September when it was announced, but the actual details of the ETS itself weren't published until last week. It's 490 pages long. So we're going to summarize the highlights here, and we will, no doubt you all have heard that the 5th District Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans has issued a temporary stay on the ETS on Saturday, so 2 days after it was published. And then it is now sort of hanging in the balance as the procedure now is to sort of roll up all of the different various lawsuits into one of the appeals courts. And I think that's selected by a panel. So that's pretty important depending on which appeals court gets this, and that court will determine the fate of the ETS. But in the meantime, because compliance with this ETS will likely require, if you have more than 100 employees, likely require some planning on your part,
it's good to go ahead and get the facts and go ahead and make a checklist of things that you might want to have researched ahead of time, regardless of whether or not this actually becomes the law of the land. So here are the highlights. Employers with 100 or more total employees across all locations must require any workers who remain unvaccinated as of January 4th, 2022 to produce a negative COVID-19 test result on at least a weekly basis before coming into work. The date to remember, even a month prior to that, is December 5th, when those individuals who are not fully vaccinated must wear a face mask while inside the workplace. So if you're not already requiring that, the OSHA ETS will require you to enforce that beginning December 5th, but you have until January 4th to enforce the vaccinate or test choice. It also says that you must provide up to 4 hours of paid time off for the time it takes for workers to get the vaccine. And you may not deduct this from their existing vacation bank if they have one. And also 2 paid sick days to recover, up to 2 paid sick days. Most people don't need 2, but or even 1, but if in the event that they need up to 2, you are to provide those paid. Now, I've read conflicting information on the second sentence, so I might have to research it further. But what I read was that this time can be taken from their existing sick leave, but you can't take it from vacation. Now, I don't know how that affects people who have combined policies, commonly referred to as a PTO policy. To be on the safe side, you can just not deduct it from their PTO policy and just pay them for that sick time. Maybe you could set up a special code in iSolved or whatever your payroll platform is to track it that way. The big thing the next 2 bullets were sort of a big question that's been looming for people in the past 2 months since the announcement is what do the employers have to pay for? We knew that the paid time off was going to be a thing, but we weren't sure about costs. So it says that you don't have to reimburse employees for transportation costs to get vaccinated. So say you're in a remote area and they have to drive 30 minutes to get the shot. You don't have to reimburse them for the mileage or gas, but you do have to provide them the paid time. Although you might have a state law that supersedes that. So if you're in California, you are required to reimburse employees for mileage. And then this bullet, the second to last bullet, is a big one. You're not required to pay for the cost of testing unless you want to. The ETS says that you can if you want, but you don't have to. And that can add up. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But if it's a weekly test for somebody who does not experiencing symptoms, typically from what I've seen is between $100 and $150 for that test. And that's not inexpensive. So we'll talk more about that in a second, but that was a big question mark and now it's been answered. The other thing, that last bullet here, is something you'll definitely want to prep for. The ETS says that you will, as the employer, needs to collect information about employee vaccination status by December 4th. So what they're saying here is that by December 4th, you should have not only a sort of ballpark estimate around the percentage of your workers who are vaccinated and who is vaccinated and who's not, but you should have documentation. So that their vaccine card, the doctor's note, some sort of proof that they've been vaccinated. And you are allowed to ask for that. You are not allowed to ask why or why not they're vaccinated or not vaccinated, but you can absolutely ask them what their status is and to provide proof. Later on, we'll talk about how you can use our iSolved platform to help you do that. Some of my clients are using spreadsheets. It's just whatever works best for your organization. Okay, a couple notes to consider here. The ETS supersedes any existing state or local requirements that limit an employer's ability to require COVID vaccination, COVID testing, or face coverings, even for non-covered employers. So even for those who have fewer than 100 employees, This is saying that even if your state has passed legislation that bars employers from requiring vaccinations or testing or face coverings, this supersedes that ruling. So that's kind of a big deal. If someone is granted a medical or religious exemption, from being vaccinated per the Americans with Disabilities Act, they still need to produce a negative weekly test and mask up. And that's also been a question I've been receiving a lot. So you've all heard about, and we'll talk about in a second, that the ADA allows for a medical or religious exemption from any sort of vaccine or mask policy. And that should be documented. And we have some forms on our website that can help you with that documentation. So that the accommodation there is that you're going to say, okay, we will grant your request to not comply with our vaccination policy. However, the accommodation we're making is that you either need to work from home or you need to wear a mask in the workplace. And now the other thing they need to do is produce a negative weekly test. So they're not exempt. They're exempt from the vaccine based on their medical or religious beliefs, but they are not exempt from this weekly testing rule. The ETS also states that COVID testing cannot be performed at home unless an authorized telehealth proctor observes the employee take the test and reads the results. So as you all have heard that there are at-home kits rolling out there in the marketplace, and which I think is great. However, right now, OSHA is not completely 100% trusting of people to report the results without a second set of eyes on those results. I'm not sure what an authorized telehealth proctor is at this point. I need to research that a bit more. And maybe some of you out there have insight on that, but that's the language from the bill. Okay, so in terms of the employee count, that 100 employee threshold includes all employees in the US, including part-time and fully remote employees. And as long as your head count remains at 100 or more, you are subject to the rules of the ETS. Temporary and seasonal workers do count. Independent contractors do not count. And then if you're a staffing agency or you employ staffing agency employees, the agency itself is responsible for its staff and must comply if they have more than 100 employees. If you're a host employer to that staffing agency staff, if you don't have 100 employees without those staffing agency employees, you are not covered. So you don't have to comply, but you are allowed to require the staffing agency to comply with any on-site policies. I hope that makes some sense. So if you have fewer than 100 employees without those employees from the staffing agency, you don't necessarily have to comply with the ETS unless you want to, but you're absolutely allowed to require the agency to prove that it's complying and or comply with whatever on-site policies that you have. Okay, so this comes up a lot too. What if someone already has had COVID? Do they need to be tested weekly or show proof of vaccination? So this ETS says employees who have received a positive COVID-19 test or have been diagnosed with COVID-19 by a licensed healthcare provider are not required to undergo COVID-19 testing for 90 days following the date of their positive test or diagnosis. I've also seen conflicting things about that, so I have a note to research this further. But as it stands, from what I've read in the ETS, it's a 90-day window where they don't have to be you don't have to test them necessarily unless you want to, but it would probably be a waste of money at that point. And then once they hit that 90-day mark, if they're not yet fully vaccinated, then they will have to produce a weekly negative test. Okay, a little bit more on contractors. Contractors and host employers with at least 100 employees are each required to ensure that they meet the ETS requirements for their own employees. Nothing in the ETS prevents host employers from imposing additional requirements for contractor employees at their work sites, such as requiring that all employees, regardless of vaccination status, wear face coverings while working indoors. And then if you do have some unionized staff, the ETS says employers in unionized workplaces with 100 or more employees must, like all covered employers, follow the minimum requirements established by the ETS, which we went over a couple slides earlier. Nothing in the ETS, however, prevents employers from agreeing with employees and their representatives to implement additional measures. And the ETS does not displace collectively bargained agreements that exceed the requirements of the ETS. Additional measures could be implemented via collective bargaining. Employers might agree to cover the cost of face coverings or medical removal, or to adopt a requirement that all employees, regardless of vaccination status, wear face coverings while working indoors. So essentially what they're saying is you're welcome to add policies that are more, even more specific than the ETS, but you're not allowed to implement a policy that's less specific than the ETS. So even though remote workers count toward your 100 employee count, they do not have to, if they truly work 100% remotely, or work entirely alone, then they do not have to have that weekly negative test if they're not vaccinated. Also, employees who work exclusively outdoors, and it does have some specific language here about what that means. It has to be on all days, not a hybrid of indoor and outdoor work. Also, the employee must not routinely occupy vehicles with other employees as part of work duties. There might be a de minimis use of indoor spaces where other individuals may be present, such as a multi-stall bathroom or an administrative office, as long as the time spent indoors is brief or occurs exclusively in the employee's home. And then the employee's work must truly occur outdoors, which does not include buildings under construction where substantial portions of the structure are in place, such as walls and ceiling elements that would impede the natural flow of fresh air at the work site. So if you have employees that fall into this category, make sure you examine these 4 bullets to make sure that they truly qualify for exemption from this testing rule. So what about if your employee count fluctuates? And I know that is the case for a lot of you. So essentially what they're saying is that you should determine your employee count as of the effective date of the ETS, which was November 5th, 2021. If you have 100 or more employees on that effective date, this ETS applies for the duration of the standard, which sources say probably will be around 6 months unless things change with the pandemic. If you have fewer than 100 employees on the effective date, again, November 5th, then the standard would not apply to you as of the effective date. However, if you subsequently hire more workers and hit that 100 employee threshold, then you would be expected to come into compliance with the standard requirements. So if that's something that might be reality for you, then I would go ahead and prep for compliance just in case. Then once you have come within the scope of the ETS, the standard continues to apply for the remainder of the time the standard is in effect, regardless of fluctuations in the size of your workforce. So if you have 103 employees on the effective date of the standard, November 5th, but then you lose 4 within the next month, you are still expected to comply with the ETS. So that's really important if you have a fluctuating workforce. And again, that 100 count does include part-time and seasonal and remote workers. Okay, so this is also in the plan. It requires you to have a written policy, either requiring all employees to be vaccinated, again, subject to those medical or religious exemptions, or allowing employees to choose between getting vaccinated or testing for COVID weekly and wearing a face covering indoors. So you've probably heard this referred to as a vaccine mandate with a testing opt-out, or you could refer to it as a testing mandate with a vaccine opt-out. Kind of depends how you want to spin it, but that's really what that first bullet is saying, and that they would like for you to have a written policy as such. Also, you may choose to have one policy for certain workers and another for different workers, depending on their job responsibilities, their location, the nature of their work, and who they work with. But as with any employment decision, please make sure you base this on legitimate business reasons and do not otherwise make choices based on preference or any other type of rationale that might be construed as discriminatory or favoritism. Your policy must be written and have specific information set out in the ETS. Templates are available on the OSHA ETS resource page under implementation. And I'm sorry, I forgot to put that link in the chat, but I will put it up on our website. I did look at that yesterday, and it's a pretty thorough template. Most of it's written for you. You just have to fill in the areas where there's blue text that is specific to your organization. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to help. You can email questions at dominionpayroll.com or form a little committee inside your organization and you guys can work on it together. There are some good, also on that page, there are some good summaries of the ETS. If you don't feel like reading all 490 pages, you guys can read it there as well. And there's also a really lengthy FAQ page that I also poured through yesterday and earlier this week. State plans. So I think 30 or so, I want to say, states in the US have what's called a state plan, which means that they have adopted their own occupational safety and health standards that are at least as effective as federal OSHA's requirements. So when an ETS comes out from federal OSHA, state plans must either amend their current standards to be identical or at least as effective as the new standard, or show that an existing state plan standard covering this area is at least as effective as the new federal standard. So if you're in a state like Virginia that has a state plan, that it doesn't mean that the ETS doesn't apply. It means that the state OSHA office has to come up with either ratchet up its current plan or make sure that their current plan is at least equal to the federal ETS. Okay, a quick word on exemptions. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, but medical or religious exemptions can be, well, let me start by saying medical or religious exemptions to a vaccine policy or a masking policy are the two permitted exemptions to those policies. And a medical exemption is pretty straightforward. The documentation should include an area where the treating physician can attest to the medical reason why this person should not be vaccinated and or wear a mask. And that requires a physician signature. You get a copy of it, you give the employee a copy, you file it in their files and keep it for a very long time. Religious exemptions are a little bit less straightforward. There's been a lot of talk about these. There's a form on our website that if you need it, that can help document religious exemptions. As of now, I've looked at a lot of different religious exemption requests, and some clients have just said, you know what, let's just let them all pass. We're just not interested in going down this rabbit hole and questioning people's religions. Other clients have been a bit more investigative in terms of what the request that's actually based on. Is it a bona fide belief or is it something else? But I wanted to say that you can deny either one of these requests if they would impose an undue hardship on you or a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the employee's coworkers, customers, or others that cannot be eliminated or sufficiently reduced by reasonable accommodation. So what they're saying here is that even though someone might have a medical or religious exemption to a vaccine or masking policy, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to 100% provide the accommodation if you can determine that it would impose an undue hardship. If you have an attorney and you're in this situation, consulting an attorney is always best. I will say that the ADA does not provide for accommodations based on personal or political beliefs. The religious belief must be sincerely held. It cannot be based on just sort of somebody's belief that they don't believe in the vaccine or don't believe in the policy or the federal government. That's not covered by the ADA. The ADA has a stringent undue hardship standard which considers whether the modification would cause significant difficulty or expense, but it doesn't apply to religious accommodations. The ADA gets very stringent around disability related requests for accommodations, and that's beyond over and above COVID. But when it comes to religious accommodations, the undue hardship standard is not necessarily as stringent, which means that you have a lot more leeway to say, you know what, this is going to put people at risk or in harm's way if you're walking around unvaccinated. And then just it goes further to say that courts have found that anything more than a de minimis or trivial cost can cause undue hardship in religious accommodation cases. And the EEOC noted in its guidance that costs include the risk of spreading the coronavirus and other safety hazards. So hopefully that makes some sense. I'm not discounting religious based exemptions, but I have had a lot of clients and done a lot of reading about that religious exemption being used as sort of a way for people to get out of a vaccine policy, and employers are it's a real tricky conversation. And these are your options as the employer in that case. Legal challenges. Yes, there have been lots of legal challenges to this ETS. On November 6th, the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans issued an emergency stay, temporarily blocking the OSHA ETS pending further action by this court. The ruling arrived after Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton filed a challenge with the court. The challenge included Louisiana, Mississippi, Utah, and that should say South Carolina. Sorry, that's cut off. And then Monday, the administration filed papers in defense of the ETS. And they said Congress, and then this is what will happen next. Congress set forth procedures governing the situation, i.e. when multiple petitions for review of a single agency order are filed in at least 2 courts of appeals within 10 days after issuance of the order. In such cases, the agency must notify the Judicial Panel on Multi-District Litigation, the DOL said in its letter to the court. So essentially, like I said earlier, there's this panel set up. So in the event that there are multiple cases around this challenging the same law filed in multiple courts, the panel decides which district court all of this legislation will go to, so that only one court will consider it instead of multiple ones. The panel will randomly select one court to hear the case, and that court will be authorized to uphold or lift the 5th Circuit's order halting the rule. The department expects the court to be selected by November 16th. So that's just the date by which the actual court will be selected, not necessarily when it will rule on the 5th Circuit's order. All right, enforcement. So what good is a rule if it's not going to be enforced, right? So OSHA has, as you all know, OSHA in general has a system where one of your employees or customers or vendors can give them a call and say, you know what, I think this company is not complying with OSHA's rules around XYZ, asbestos, or safe usage of ladders or whatever the rule is. And that also is the case here. So they have a system set up where somebody in your office or somebody who's come in contact with your workplace can call and say, hey, I don't think XYZ employer is complying with this ETS. And then they will come in and inspect the claim, determine whether it's valid, and then you could be subject to fines of up to $13,600 per violation. So something to consider. I don't mean to sound scary, but that's what's published as part of this ETS. It seems to me the word on the street is that they're going to be pretty focused on this in terms of enforcement. But again, it's not like you're going to be randomly visited. It's more of somebody is going to report you kind of situation. So take that as you want to take it. So in my mind, I think if you haven't already started to think about how you would comply with this ETS, I would go ahead and follow some steps, even though the fate of the ETS remains up in the air, because the timeline for compliance is pretty tight. December 5th, it's going to be here very soon, and then January 4th, is also going to be here before we know it. And that's really the one where the rubber meets the road. So go ahead and get your internal COVID brain team together and get your brain trust together and create a clear and compliant policy. And again, there's a template on OSHA's website, and we'll post it on our website this week. Determine how you will collect vaccine information, whether you're going to have one point person collect all of the cards, take pictures of them, post them somewhere. Will it be supervisors who then upload them? Will the employees upload them? What is the best thing for your workplace? What's the most efficient way? I will say here that if you've got photos of people's vaccine cards floating around, whether, because your process is that your employees send them to managers or HR, make sure after they're uploaded or otherwise recorded, make sure you delete those from your hard drives, phones, however those have come to you, just to make sure that you don't leave any sort of HIPAA protected medical information trail. 2 is a pretty big one. 3 is a really big one, particularly if you have a fair number of employees who aren't vaccinated and will need to comply with this weekly testing rule. Go ahead and get a sense of who's vaccinated and who's not. And in fact, you have to do that by December 4th. And then try and estimate the cost and logistics of these, the testing. Will you pay for it? Will the employees pay for it? Will you set up a partnership with a local lab such as BetterMed or Quest Diagnostics to implement this, to make it a little bit easier for everybody to have a predictable process and a predictable test result reporting system? That's a big one. And if you have a lot of people who are vaccinated and it's just a handful of people, even still, it might be best to partner with a local lab so that you can just go ahead and set it up and make it as easy as possible and mitigate any sort of low morale or anything like that. It's already going to require a lot of tactical messaging to your employees in the first place, but so doing what you can to make that testing piece easy, I think would be really helpful. Number 4, consider a mandatory vaccine policy to avoid the testing requirement. Now that's really up to you and your workplace. Some people have gone that route, and you just need to make sure that you're prepared to discipline folks for not complying, whether that's unpaid leave, termination, reassignments. If you have an HR person in-house, definitely come up with a plan with them before you make a mandatory vaccine policy. If you have questions, I'm happy to help, or you have an attorney to consult. You're within your rights to implement a mandatory vaccine policy. There are just some real considerations to look at beforehand, but that's one way to avoid that testing requirement. The 5th step here is to outline your process for accommodation requests, determine somebody on staff who will receive and process those requests, and who on staff will be reviewing them and making decisions based on whether or not to grant those medical or religious accommodation requests. And how will you notify the employee either way? What will be the accommodation itself? Will they work from home? Will they have to wear a mask? Well, they will have to wear a mask if you're going to comply with this ETS by December 4th. So make that real clear to the employees. Where do they go if they have an accommodation request? Is there a form they should use? And then what's the turnaround time for that decision, and how will they be notified? And then number 6, if you have an attorney on hand, it's always great to consult them, let them know what you're considering. They might have some things to point out that I haven't pointed out here. And particularly if you're going to go the number 4 route here with a mandatory vaccine policy, I would certainly talk to either an HR professional or an attorney just to make sure you've considered all of the options. Okay, I'm going to take a quick look at the Q&A here just before we switch gears.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a couple questions out there. Do you want me to read to you?
Yeah, I'm going to take a sip of water.
Okay. What is the definition of a telehealth proctor? And I know you said you were going to look into that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I apologize, Jerry. I didn't look into that before today. So I'll find out and we'll post it, but I'm assuming it's somebody who's a physician or nurse, who is able to, observe your test results via computer and attest to its legitimacy. So I'm not sure, but I'm not sure if that applies to people who are not necessarily certified in the medical field. I'm not quite sure. So I'll find out.
Okay, thank you. And Erica asked, and I think she clarified it, is the 13,000 per employee not vaccinated?
It says per violation. So I read that as per employee, but I don't know for sure. I can look into that, Erica, but I read it as per person, but I don't know.
I would think it was per person, but also it's just per incidence, right, of non-compliance.
Yeah, and I don't know what that means. Like, what happens? So, if say I call up OSHA and say, "Hey, Dominion Payroll didn't test its non-vaccinated employees this week." Is that just one violation because they missed a testing week, or is it?
Well, I would think that would be per person, because
Generally-
I think it's going to be like one person didn't do it.
Mhm.
Yeah, generally speaking, OSHA is pretty quick to do a fine for each violation, and so part of, like, when you hear that 1,000, I mean, for a huge company, if it's just a single violation, that's not a huge deterrent. But if it's over, people, it adds up really quickly. But OSHA, sort of famously will come in and go, that's a violation, and every day that we can find this violation, they'll get another fine.
Okay, well, that's expensive.
Yeah, OSHA like can look cheap with some of their like limitations in terms of what they can fine, but they are quite creative in getting them to add up quickly.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin. I didn't know you were our in-house resident OSHA enforcement expert.
At some point in this webinar series, I did some research on OSHA.
Okay. Good to know.
Okay,
right.
so you have another one. We are a federal contractor with over 100 employees. Do the same standards apply to us or more stringent rules?
There's a separate rules for federal contractors.
Yeah, I believe they have to be vaccinated.
Yeah.
So yeah, yes, there are more stringent rules for them.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I actually had something in here about that and then I took it out. I don't know why. Sorry about that, Andy. But yeah, I believe federal contractors are now subject to the same rules as federal employees, which is there's no test out option. It's just vaccinated or not. And if they're not vaccinated, then they need to have a medical or religious exemption and they need to wear masks.
Mm-hmm.
And then
lastly, you have, is the time it takes for an hourly employee to test considered compensatable time? I don't think so. The only thing that you had to give time for was the vaccine.
Yeah, the testing, you don't have to pay for that time for anybody, for hourly or salaried. Now you can, particularly if it's close by and it takes a couple seconds, they can sort of just tack it on to their maybe coming in on the way into work that day. But if it is, you can basically, the ETS says you don't have to pay for testing time. You can if you want to. So I guess it just depends, Michael, on, is that a 15-minute consideration or is that an hour and a half because you have you're a more remote workplace or somebody. Now, if say your workplace is located in Richmond City and somebody lives in Goochland and their testing location is in the city near your workplace, and they drive in like they normally would every day to work, regardless of this COVID situation, I wouldn't consider that commute time to be something that's testing related. It's basically, that's the commute time they would have anyway, whether they were coming in to get tested or not. So I hope that makes some sense, but no, you don't have to pay for the testing time.
Okay. And then lastly, there's a comment that says, I work for a federal contractor and the rules are vaccinated by 1/4/22 with no testing options, can be exempt by the medical or religious.
Yep, thank you, Anonymous. So January 4th is when federal contractors and federal employees need to be either vaccinated or have that exemption paperwork filed. Okay, what happens if the employee does not have sick time accrued? Do we have to provide additional sick time? If they get the vaccine, Erica, and they need time to recover, then you're required by the ETS to provide paid sick time, regardless of whether or not they have any accrued, or if you have a sick time policy. You're just, that day is a paid day. If they, the testing, you don't have to require, you don't have to provide time for, you can if you want. I'm trying to think what other instances you would need to provide. Oh, if they go to get vaccinated, you should pay for that time too. And I would just code it as, unless it's like it shouldn't take too long. Vaccinations don't take long at all. And unless they're in a rural area and need to drive really far, I would recommend just paying for that time and coding it. You can code it separately in your payroll system, just so you can see that it was done for a vaccination or first shot, second shot. And we can show you how to do that in our system. I hope that answered your question. All right, speaking of our system, we're going to jump into Tracy's. We're going to call Tracy back in to talk about how you can use iSolve to track vaccination status and COVID testing.
Yeah. So in our system, it's going to be underneath of, there's a typo in there.
That's okay.
This is going to be under the miscellaneous fields. So that's going to be your COVID vaccination status. And then I'm going to also talk about the COVID testing, which can be done under miscellaneous data sets. All right, so the first thing you want to do is see if you actually have access to the miscellaneous fields. Where you would see this would be under employee management, employee maintenance, and then you would scroll down to look for the miscellaneous fields. And if you don't have access to that, then you want to send a request to customer service for access, and we can help you out with that. If you had a PPP loan with us, it's likely that, or not a loan with us, but if you used our system for forgiveness, it's likely that you had access to those miscellaneous fields, because that's where you would have done any overrides or if you had any FTE exceptions. So it's the same place, but this time it's going to be about COVID. Okay, so granting employees and or managers or supervisors access to the miscellaneous fields to be able to enter in information is a two-step process. So you'll need to contact us at customer service to ask for those self-service roles to be turned on. So you can see where I have the ESS miscellaneous fields FA, and FA stands for full access. You can give that access to your employees and or the managers or supervisors. Most of our clients are just giving access to the employees, and then the client admin, no other access to that miscellaneous field area. But at any rate, it's twofold, because what this does under self-service roles is actually gives the employee access to the screen, the miscellaneous field screen. But then over under miscellaneous fields, then you can designate who is actually going to be able to see that field. So even giving them access to the miscellaneous field screen doesn't give them access to all the miscellaneous fields, because you may have other things there. Like, for instance, if you have your PPP FTE exceptions, or you have the overrides, you don't want your employees to see that. I mean, it's not necessary for them to see that. So those will be closed off to them. They'll only see the ones that you actually designate that you want them to see. So you would let us know, hey, I want these miscellaneous fields. And can you give our employees access?
Oops, I'm sorry. My bad. Okay, sorry.
Sorry. Okay. What does the miscellaneous field screen look like to those who have access? So these are the things that you can have set up. You don't have to have all of them, but you can have the vaccination status, the vaccination type, the date of the first dose, the second dose, the booster, a little checkbox for COVID vaccine card uploaded. And then also you can have notes, like for instance, if someone had a religious exemption, then you could put that in the notes for unvaccinated. You could just say that they have a religious exemption or a medical exemption or anything like that. So that's what you can put here. I should say also under that vaccination card upload, we now have subcategories that can be added to the document screen. So you can have a subcategory under EE uploads to be the vaccination card, and or you can have one that says COVID testing if you want to have those uploaded as well. Reporting. So a custom HR report can be written to capture all the data that's collected. So you can see here, this one is just showing the employee number, the employee name, their status, their vaccination type, when they had their first and second dose and booster, and whether or not their vaccination card was uploaded.
That's really nice. It's a good feature.
Yep. And then you can filter for those who are, fully vaccinated or just the partial and the non-vaccinated. Okay, let's look at the COVID test tracking. So this is going to be under miscellaneous data sets. And if we can go forward, thank you. Same thing as before, you have to actually give your employees access to the screen. So you can see there I have ESS, miscellaneous data sets, FA, and you need a check mark in there. If you don't have that, if your employees don't have access to the miscellaneous data sets, and they probably don't because there was no reason for them to have that, you can reach out to us at customer service and they can have that turned on. And then we will put in a miscellaneous field of the COVID testing so that your employees will be able to see it. And this is what it looks like for the employees. So if they go out to that miscellaneous data sets, down there you can press add new, they can put in the test date and then their test results. And then it'll have a whole data set on the different days that they did it. You can also have a custom report written for this. I don't think I have a copy of that. But yes, you can have that tracked. So you can have a report you can have it done each week so you can see that your employees are actually adhering to the law.
Tracy, can they ask the employee, can they put the onus on the employees to update their record with their weekly test results? Excuse me.
Yeah, and they can have them loaded to the employee uploads under documents. We'll just put in a category for that, and then you can see the date that it was uploaded and everything.
Okay. Yeah, because this could be, depending on how many tests are taking place each week, this could be an administrative time.
But you can run a report for each week and see, who's doing what.
Yeah, I think that would be great to have the employee be responsible for updating, and then you can run a weekly report as the admin.
Oh, I did have a report. So there it is. But you can have it filtered so it just shows one line for your employees. So you don't have to see every time they tested, because it could get really lengthy if you had a lot of employees that weren't vaccinated.
And so for them to get this all set up, if they haven't already, they can email customer service at dominionpayroll.com.
Yep. As soon as they send in a request, we have a macro that'll go out, and it basically shows you a little picture of here's what you can have set up. And then you just let us know which one of these fields that you want, who you want to have access, and whether or not you need a report.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, I know we've gone a little over time, everybody. I appreciate your patience. I don't see any other questions. Hopefully that means we've either answered all of them or you guys are just reeling from all this information. But thank you so much for joining us today. We, of course, will stay on top of things. We'll get to the bottom of the telehealth Proctor definition. We'll post some things on our website, and including this presentation by the close of business today, so you can download it and listen to it again if you'd like. Thank you, Tracy and Kevin and Olivia. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was good.
Your thing. Happy to be here.
Yep.
All right. Until next time, we'll see you guys soon.
Bye.
Bye.